In 2015, director F. Gary Gray gave the world a driven narrative about one of hip-hop's most controversial collectives.
In 2020, we revisit a fan favorite among weeded bourbons.
The film is Straight Outta Compton.
The whiskey is Weller 12-Year.
And we'll review them both. This is
the Film and Whiskey Podcast. Welcome to the Film and Whiskey Podcast, where each week we review a classic movie and a glass of whiskey. I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And this week we are looking at the 2015 film Straight Outta Compton. Brad, this is the movie that won our listener vote across social media and Discord. It was pretty close there for a while between this movie and A Star Is Born, but Straight Outta Compton really ended up running away with it.
Yeah, I was a little bit curious to see 8 Mile. Eminem is probably the only rapper that I was kind of like, as a kid, was like, oh, yeah, Eminem, he's kind of cool. Other than that, I'm not going to lie, Bob, I had zero clues about the hip-hop scene from like 98 to 2009, you know?
Okay. So
like
the pre-Drake era was really not your bag.
Yeah, I will also say that Drake is definitely not my bag.
Okay, well, that's good, because he's not mine either. So I will say this, Brad, this is going to be a really interesting episode for us to record. We've talked a little bit about hip-hop on this show before.
Is it because we're two white guys?
We are very white. I don't know if you guys have all noticed, but we are two of the whitest guys you will ever meet. However, I will say this, I am a huge hip-hop fan. I have been for forever. NWA, I've obviously listened to the Straight Outta Compton album. I like Dr. Dre. The Chronic is a fantastic album. I'm really excited to talk about the movie. I saw a couple comments on our Discord where people were saying, like, I'm voting for Straight Outta Compton just so I can hear Bob have to talk about gangsta rap. And I'm like, haha, joke's on you. I know this whole album. So like
I grew up in Barberton.
That's right. I grew up on the streets of the
Straight out of Barberton.
Straight out of Barberton. But yeah, Brad, this was not a movie that was on our schedule. We opened it up for a listener special, and this is the one that the people have chosen. So I'm curious to see where this one ends up.
Yeah, and you don't really need to wonder. I had not seen Straight Outta Compton before this viewing.
Were you familiar with the subject of this movie, which was the rap group NWA?
I had heard of them, and when they played Straight Outta Compton and F the Police, I was familiar with those songs. I was like, oh yeah, I've heard these before. But yeah, so I recognized a few things, you know, that they did. But Bob, I'm just going to be 100% straight up about my background. I grew up in like solidly middle class suburbs of Cleveland, Ohio. Like not upper class, not lower class, just kind of a bunch of white people. You know, there was probably about 3 or 4 black kids at my high school. That was about it. It was mostly Ukrainians and Polish people. But yeah, that's kind of the background for me growing up. So no, I wasn't heavily exposed to NWA in my childhood or teenage years.
I think that's understandable, Brad. And, you know, as far as this podcast goes, we have not talked about hip hop a lot. We have not had a ton. We have not had a ton of movies on the podcast that have been kind of solidly from the African American community. And, you know, it might be kind of reductionistic to make the comparison here, but I think that the closest analog to this movie would be Do the Right Thing in terms of what we've watched for the show. And particularly, I say that because Do the Right Thing, 1989, has this huge anthemic song that comes out of it by Public Enemy called Fight the Power. And what Public Enemy was doing in Do the Right Thing and what NWA is doing with Straight Outta Compton, it is a roughly similar thing. And yet, even between those two groups, what NWA was doing with their music was so much more confrontational, so much more harder to swallow for white people that, you know, it's still, I think, a very controversial album to listen to.
Yeah. Well, I mean, just think about the titles of those two songs. They both have 3 words in them. One is fight the power. And like, I think any human being can recognize that there are systems of power that oppress certain people, right? Like there's, there's dictatorships in in places like North Korea. And like, yeah, so like, I think we can all kind of get behind a message of like, yeah, fight the power. Like that's a reality sometimes that you have to do. America was founded on fighting the power. But like, in the end, those are, it's just very different words that are expressing a similar sentiment, but one of them is much more palatable than the other.
Yeah. And again, I'm not saying that it has to be palatable. Like, I think what NWA did with their music really kind of awoke a lot of people to what was going on in LA, in the late 1980s and early 90s. And Brad, before we get too far down the rabbit hole of our analysis here, I think it's time that we back up a little bit and we introduce America's favorite segment, Brad Explains. This is where Brad breaks down the plot of the movie that he has just seen, often for the first time, and we know that that is the fact today. So, Brad, can you offer our listeners a spoiler-filled synopsis of the movie Straight Outta Compton?
Yeah, Bob, I would love to get into Straight Outta Compton, which is a story about the rise, fall, and possible reunification of the group known as NWA. Now, NWA was a hip-hop group out of the mid to late 80s into the early 90s that was made up of a group of guys with stage names of Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, Eazy-E, DJ Yella, and MC Ren. And they came to just utterly dominate the charts for about a period of 4 to 5 years. And they helped shed light on what was happening to Black people, mostly, but minorities in general, across the country. And, for them, mostly out of LA, the Compton Street area. We follow how the group is formed, how they start to create their music, and then, how money and management begins to divide them, causing some of them to go off and have solo careers. And really, it actually follows a pretty classic formula for a musical biopic. You see the awesome moments, the cool concerts that they have. You see some of the crazy stuff that happens with the FBI threatening to shut them down and their Detroit concert, going just absolutely crazy with gunshots and the police arresting them and all sorts of things happening. But in the end, what it really tells is the story of a group of men who are utterly committed to telling the truth and to performing in the way that they want to perform. And you see how that takes them to the right places and the wrong places. It's a mostly honest movie that really cares about its subject matter.
Yeah, totally agree. And again, Brad, we've gone through this time and time again with these musical biopics that we've been kind of going through. I do think you could use the words paint by numbers a little bit again with this one. And yet, like, I'm in a weird spot with this movie because I feel like in terms of how much I like this movie, I'm closer to Walk the Line than I am to Bohemian Rhapsody, which is a very good thing. But for me, this movie it does a lot of the good things that Walk the Line did, which is making the world feel realistic, making the dialogue seem realistic, even though it's, at times very forced, making a believable environment for me as a viewer to understand what was going on in these people's lives. It doesn't seem fake. It doesn't seem overly sanitized. And yet at the same time, I think it does fall into some of those pitfalls of Bohemian Rhapsody, where once in a while the dialogue is just really cringeworthy. And, if you want to bring the real historical record into things, they definitely do portray the people in NWA in a really positive light. And that's because the group was heavily involved in the making of this movie. And so, like, it has almost all the positives and almost all the negatives represented here in the same movie.
Yeah, and we'll just be open about this from the start. One of the most important things to think about when you are evaluating a biopic or a historical film of any matter is the fact that, like, sometimes certain subject matter is just more interesting than others.
Yeah.
And so when you look at Straight Outta Compton, I don't think anybody could watch the movie and go, yeah, the subject matter just wasn't that interesting. Like, their lives were hectic. It was chaotic. They have massive amounts of talent that is undeniable. And so you do have to kind of take that to the side and say, yep, NWA was just nuts. Like, the stuff they did was crazy. Their lives were insane, and recognize that. And I think on the second watch through of the movie, you can actually sit back and say, okay, I get that all of their lives were just maniacally fascinating. But how is the actual movie itself?
Y'all just got a snapshot of how Americans really feel. We gave the people a voice. We gave the people truth.
Yeah, but your songs, they glamorize the lifestyle of gangs, guns, drugs.
Our art is a reflection of our reality. What you see when you go outside your door?
I know what I see.
And it ain't glamorous.
You get AKs from Russia and cocaine from Colombia.
And ain't none of us got a passport, so might want to check the source.
Yeah, next question.
Will you be more careful about what you say, how you say it?
No. Probably not, no.
Wow. Freedom of speech includes rap music, right? But we exercising our First Amendment as far as I'm concerned.
And again, it gets to this idea that all movies are fictionalized, right? Like, even a documentary. You don't just, like, when you go to see a documentary movie, you don't just sit down and watch the 100 hours of raw footage that they captured. Like, they edit that stuff, and they make a narrative out of it. You have to tell a compelling story. And it's the same thing with people's lives in biopics. Like, of course, what they're going to do is fictionalize and editorialize a little bit to make some of these, narrative arcs cleaner and to kind of, streamline some things that happened in their lives. And that obviously happens here. We'll get into some of the more problematic stuff in our analysis. But Brad, I think for the most part, this movie really, really succeeds when it comes to being a biopic. And I think that you have to thank the director, F. Gary Gray, for that.
Yeah, it really does. I think one of my few issues with, like, the technical direction of the movie is that NWA was a 5-man group, but I feel like I left the movie only knowing about Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, and Eazy-E.
For sure.
DJ Yella and MC Ren might have just been supporting characters. Like, if you just looked at the movie, it would have felt like they had no personalities, no opinions, that they were there just to support the big three.
Well, and again,
I don't know if that's the case in real life. Maybe it was, but there was definitely a sense of top heaviness to the group.
For sure. And I mean, Eazy-E, obviously, he dies. He's viewed as kind of like a hip hop martyr in a way. And so they take their time to memorialize him in this movie. But Yella and Ren were not the popular members of this group. They didn't go on to achieve huge success in the way that you saw with Ice Cube, who has become a really prominent figure in movies, and with Dr. Dre, who is now a billionaire and like still producing music. And it's kind of like, like to the victor goes the spoils a little bit, because those two guys were the driving force behind this film. And it really does remind me of the Queen biopic, Bohemian Rhapsody, where you have people like Brian May who are really driving the narrative and kind of forcing the writers to portray them in a certain way. And it really does come up, I think, as much as I love what F. Gary Gray does with the direction here. He has a really profoundly real sense of Compton in the late 80s and 90s because he was there. He filmed Ice Cube's video for It Was a Good Day back in like 93. He's been collaborating with Ice Cube for like almost 30 years now, so he's a very natural choice to tell this story in a way. But the flip side of that is I think he also knows how to portray these guys in a really positive light because he's so used to them. And I do feel like this movie tips into a little bit of like, even though some of the characters are like dealing and or using drugs, even though these characters are cheating on their significant others, they still come out kind of squeaky clean at the end of the movie for the most part.
Yeah, it's an impressive job that he does to keep, Ice Cube, Dr. Dre, and Eazy-E pretty much like heroes in this film. Like, they are your white knights in this movie, and, you're rooting for them all the way through, which is an impressive job. But when you look at the actual record, they were kind of rough guys.
Yeah, I mean, especially Dre. Like, I think Dre was involved in some things that didn't even come up in this movie a little bit. And we'll get into talking about that in a little bit. But I do want to focus on some of the things that F. Gary Gray did, positively in this film. And one thing that really struck me on this watch through was that the historical context is so important to this film. Both the context that the movie portrays, like, the time frame that the movie happens, and the context of the actual film coming out into the world. This movie was released in 2015. It came out a year after the Michael Brown shooting in Ferguson, which seems like a lifetime ago now. But the movie had already been in development and been shooting before Ferguson happened. And I feel like to come out the year after Ferguson, it really, it set the box office on fire because it was such a hot button topic about police brutality and the response to that among Black people in this country. And it's really kind of amazing that the timing on that worked out the way that it did. But it's really important because I feel like even if this movie had come out in 2013, I don't think it would have moved the needle as much as it did. But because we were already having that discussion as a nation again about police brutality, about, what Black people face in their communities, the general population was more ready for this movie than they would have been. And it's an unfortunate fact of the matter. We all wish that didn't happen in Ferguson, but we were more ready to talk about this than we were a couple years before that.
Yeah, Bob, this was such an important movie for when it came out, and it's an important movie for today, because I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a lot of racial tension in our country right now, and movies like Straight Outta Compton can help people understand better what is faced by the average Black person in America today. Mm-hmm. But I do want to get into that more when we evaluate the movie later. But right now, I'm curious, Bob, just as a movie, as a musical biopic, where are you at on this movie? What did you like about it? What did you dislike? How are you feeling about this film just simply as a film?
Yeah, so I think that's why I brought up this historical context thing, because right from the beginning of the movie, the director places you in the context of all these events happening. It's not just like Ice Cube is angry and here's his song about it, and you have to kind of catch up to it. They take their time establishing, over the opening credits, you hear a voiceover of Ronald Reagan talking about the war on drugs, and then you cut to Compton, 1986, and you find this guy, Eazy-E, who's dealing drugs. And then, the police show up with a SWAT team and a battering ram and break into this drug house that he's inside, and he has to escape over the rooftops. And it cuts to black and shows the title Straight Outta Compton. And it is like a jarring bolt of an intro to this movie. And they do it so well. I really, really felt like they set this world up in such a realistic and understandable way that it really delves you into, the circumstances and the environment that these guys had around them on a daily basis.
Yeah, and you can't understate that impact with why they made the music that they made. And I think the movie does a spectacular job in the first half of the film of showing the creative origin of their music and the creative process of bringing that music to life. And I think that's where this movie really succeeds, is in the first half.
We're trying to check these bangers, make sure they're clean.
All right, I'm sorry. These are not bangers, okay? These are artists.
Excuse me, artists?
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yeah.
What kind of artists?
Rappers, and they're working with me in the studio right now.
Well, see, rap is not an art. And I'm sorry, who are you?
I'm the manager.
Well, you're wasting your time, Mr. Manager.
You gotta be kidding me.
You're wasting your time.
Really?
These clients of yours, these rappers, they look like gang members.
You can't come down here and arrest people just because of what they look like. Are you crazy? But that's police harassment.
You said you're a manager, right?
Yeah.
Not a f***ing lawyer.
Does that matter? You cannot come down here and harass these guys because they're Black. People have rights.
Step back.
Right,
step back.
I'll step back. You let them up. Get up, guys.
The second half really just gets bogged down in kind of drama between the band and money, and you lose that sense of energy that the movie had early in the film. I don't know, Bob, is that something that you picked up on?
No, I totally agree, Brad. It really does become this conversation about contracts and who's getting paid and is their manager kind of swindling them. And that's it's compelling in its own right. but it doesn't have the kind of dramatic weight of the stuff that we saw in the early parts of this movie, which was, you know, people dealing drugs and getting arrested and getting beaten up by the police, and these guys, you know, wanting to get their dreams out there and get out of Compton and succeed. And like, you get to that point and then it feels like, okay, now we're going to talk about the other obstacles they faced. And those obstacles in the second half just don't seem as dramatic as what you've watched for the first hour.
Yeah, and it's a little bit unfortunate, but I will say that first half of the movie carries you through the rest of the film. You know, you really fall in love with the characters of Dr. Dre and Ice Cube. I don't know, Bob. I struggled with Eazy-E. He is not my favorite character in this movie. And I think part of it is his voice. Like, for some reason, that little bit higher pitched, whiny voice just doesn't work for me.
Which is accurate, though.
Like, yeah, it's just...
That's what Eazy sounded like.
Yeah, and like, in listening to their album, that's what he sounded like in real life. And I know that probably works for a lot of people. I just personally prefer not that voice.
So I will say, I think Jason Mitchell, who plays Eazy-E, is a fantastic actor. I think he really nails the last few scenes that he has after he's diagnosed with HIV.
She's pregnant, Doc. What does this mean?
It doesn't necessarily mean that she's contracted the virus, but we have to test her to be sure.
So what do? When we start the treatment, I mean, I got to get healthy. I got things to do. What are we supposed to do?
Mr. Wright, you need to understand that you are very, very sick.
I don't even feel that bad, Doc. Don't tell me that.
With care and palliative care, we can probably keep you comfortable for maybe 6 months at the very most.
Comfortable? What do you mean, comfortable?
The movie really kind of comes back down to the ground a little bit when that diagnosis comes. The problem is it comes so late in the movie, and I think Eazy-E is dead within like 10 minutes. And you've spent like an hour in this kind of middle section of the movie where the most dramatic thing was like, is their manager, played by Paul Giamatti, cheating them out of money, that they don't spend quite enough time giving Eazy-E's, you know, decline and death its proper due. But I do think that Jason Mitchell, who plays him, fantastic. I think across the board, the acting in this movie is like top notch. O'Shea Jackson Jr. playing his own dad, Ice Cube, is phenomenal. And like, I can't imagine what it must have been like for him to have to play his own dad. Like, in some ways, it's probably pretty easy because he spends so much time with him. It's like a method thing. But in another sense, like, it had to be really hard to capture that.
Yeah, O'Shea Jackson Jr., I thought really was the best performance.
Yeah, probably.
I think that Corey Hawkins as Dr. Dre was just awesome as well. But man, Ice Cube is a compelling character in this film. And for somebody who grew up seeing Ice Cube in movies,
he's a very different person.
I just feel like
90s Ice Cube and 2000s Ice Cube, very different.
Yeah, like I just feel like 90s Ice Cube is barrel proof, and 2000s Ice Cube is like
Southern comfort.
Not even 80 proof. It's like the grocery store that doesn't have a liquor license and sells 42 proof liquor.
Yeah.
Like that's about the Ice Cube that I saw growing up. So for me, it was a little bit hard to believe Ice Cube as this hard ass, just like kind of guy. You know what I mean?
And the funny thing is, like, for those of us who knew Ice Cube back in the day, now we're like, all right, dude, you need to stop making Are We There Yet movies because this is not you.
Right. Yeah, and after a little bit, I think you grow to believe, like, yeah, this is real Ice Cube, not movies Ice Cube.
Right. Yeah, man, I agree. And for me, one of the highlights of the movie, which is not like a really important scene or anything, but it's like the first time that you actually see Ice Cube get up on stage and, like, you know, drop a verse on people. It, like in that club where everybody has jerry curls, which was a hilarious kind of aside for like that club manager, super funny. But the first time you actually really get to see Ice Cube rap, his flow is phenomenal. Like, and it just infuses this movie with an energy where you're like, oh, dang, there's something special happening here. You know, and then they go into the studio and Eazy-E is recording his verses, and you can tell that like some of these guys aren't natural rappers. And then every time they cut back to Ice Cube rapping, you're like, okay, I totally get this. His rhymes are so intricate. His flow's impeccable. There's that scene where he's making the kind of diss track against NWA when he branches off on his own called No Vaseline, which I think is actually Ice Cube's, like, it's his pinnacle for me. I think it's his best few verses as a writer and as a rapper. And I think they capture it so well, like the raw energy that comes off him when he's performing.
Yeah, O'Shea Jackson Jr. really just knocks it out of the park in this film. But if I'm being honest, Bob, I'm getting to the point where I am ready for this Weller 12 to knock it out of the park as well.
All right, man, let's give it a try. All right, so today we are checking out Weller 12 Year. Brad, this is somehow one of the hardest to find whiskeys in the world, it seems like now. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised because this comes from the Buffalo Trace Company, who are masters at driving up demand for their product and then not releasing very much of it.
Yeah, Bob, I just don't understand it. I love me some Eagle Rare and a few of their other products. But in the end, I think what drives me nuts about Buffalo Trace is that their regular output, Buffalo Trace, isn't that good. And so there's something in me that there's a dissonance about the fact that Buffalo Trace puts out all these, the BTAC and these psychotically sought after whiskeys. When I'm like, you can't even make regular whiskey that good.
All right, listen, I don't like Buffalo Trace, but they make some good whiskey.
They do. I'm being salty right now, Bob.
You are a little bit, but it's understandable because we've had a lot of their products on the show over the last couple of years, and we had to go all the way back to season 1 for the last time we had Weller. We had Weller Special Reserve, which is their kind of, the lowest tier version of the Weller line, and then Weller 107, which is called Weller Antique. Now, Weller 12 Year is the next step up in that line. This used to retail just like Weller Antique for between $25 and $30. Over the last 5 years, it has absolutely skyrocketed in price, both by what's actually set by MSRP and what, it costs on the secondary market. And the reason for that is because Weller is what we call a wheated bourbon. And that means that after corn, which we all know, bourbon has to be 51% corn, the next highest used ingredient, the kind of flavoring grain, is wheat instead of rye. And there are not a lot of, or there at least there didn't used to be, a lot of bourbons out there that were wheated bourbons. And Weller became one of the most sought after ones, and especially because it uses the same mash bill as Pappy Van Winkle, which is also made by the Buffalo Trace Company. And
Never heard of it, Bob.
I know, right? And so when Pappy started to get its reputation and fly off the shelves, people found out that if you buy a bottle of Weller Antique 107 and a bottle of Weller 12 Year and mix them to the correct ratio, it tastes exactly like Pappy Van Winkle. And they started to call it poor man's Pappy. The problem now is that so many people buy Weller Antique and Weller 12 Year that it has gone the way of Pappy Van Winkle, and it is allocated now, even in Ohio. Like, they do a bottle lottery just to get a bottle of Weller 12. It is like, it's had this insane trajectory over the last couple years.
Well, we could keep talking about the history of the whiskey. I just want to drink it. In the end, the stories are crazy. I don't understand how these things happen. I am just a poor whiskey peasant that enjoys consuming it from time to time. So, Bob, being the peasant that I am, I just want to get to the nose.
Let's do it, man.
What are you picking up on the nose of this whiskey?
Well, I will say this is a 90 proof whiskey, so it's not like we're going barrel proof or anything like that. So it's lower proof than the Weller Antique that we had a couple years ago. Brad, the predominant note that I'm getting on this, and this might be weird, but it smells like fresh strawberries. Like if you've ever sliced strawberries for a fruit salad, it has this really, really pleasant, light, bright, early summer strawberry note to it. And I'm really digging it. Like there's a little bit of spice, there's a little bit of alcohol. I get quite a bit of oak. Again, it's been aged for 12 years, so you would expect that oak. But it's much, much brighter and less kind of peppery than I thought it would be, with a really pleasant top note of strawberry.
I think growing up in Northeast Ohio, we were really blessed to be near Amish country. And Bob, I think what I'm getting on this is like an Amish fresh strawberry jam. You know what I'm talking
but like
about?
Almost a little bit of like biscuity, like almost like a strawberry pie for me.
Yeah. And I was going to use the analogy of strawberry jelly, but I didn't want people to think about like Smuckers or something like that.
Also
like,
a Northeast Ohio brand.
Also a Northeast Ohio. Dude, we're just repping today.
I know.
But like, this has like that fresh, homey country jam smell to it that I am just eating up. It's spectacular.
Now, let me ask you this. Did you notice the strawberry before I made that connection, or was it something that you were kind of like, oh, what is that note?
I don't know if I would have used the word strawberry, but I did have a sense of jam about it. Like, it had that sweet sugariness that didn't feel fake in any way. It felt incredibly real and fresh.
Brad, I'm going to give this an 8.5 on the nose. I really like this a lot. I'm tempted to give it a higher score than that, but we've talked about before that, like, I think we always kind of are too cautious on the nose because we haven't tasted it, so we don't know what's coming next. So I'll just stick it an 8.5 for now.
I think I'm going to go at a 7.5. This is like really solid. It's above average. I don't know. There's not enough of it. I like have to shove my nose in the glass to get it. So I'm a little bit nervous about whether or not the flavor will translate.
As I recall, and I've tried this once before, Brad, when it comes to the poor man's Pappy mix, the Weller Antique brought all the flavor and the Weller 12 brought all the spice. And so I'm wondering if I'm going to feel the same after not having tried it for a couple years now. But let's give it a sip and see what we think of the flavor profile on this. All right, Brad, so what I'm getting on this is kind of interesting because that strawberry flavor really carries over for me, almost like a ripe strawberry. And then you get the alcohol burn. It is kind of alcohol forward for 90 proof. There's a ton of oak in this, and it starts off as a kind of spiciness, a nice pepperiness. But if I could divide from the front of your tongue to the back into like 5 zones, the first, like the tip of your tongue, it was delicious. The second was really nice. The third, some good spice. The fourth was like this overwhelmingly bitter, nasty, oaky, just like sucking on an oak stave. And then the fifth was back to normal again, and some nice strawberry lingering on the finish. It's really weird because it's just like one zone of my mouth in particular that isn't liking this, but it's like nice, prominently bad, back to nice again. So I don't know how to evaluate this.
Yeah, the taste on this is actually pretty interesting, Bob. You're getting some of that jam that I picked up on the nose. There's a little more woodiness as I get into it. It's a little drier than I expected. And it's not necessarily terrible that it switches like that. It's just a little bit surprising. So I think it's a solid flavor profile. The palate just kind of takes you to some places that I didn't necessarily expect. I don't know if I'm getting that bitterness that you're talking about, but there is some great stuff going on here. I think I'm going to stick at a 7.5 for the flavor.
Yeah, I think I'll give mine a 6.5 on the flavor. It's a completely different profile than Weller Antique, whereas that one brings it has a lot of spice and a lot of heat to it, obviously at 107, but it has those classic bourbon-y notes to it. This one has fruit and oak, and that's pretty much it. It's not really complex, and I think it does kind of go in peaks and valleys in terms of like its consistency across the palate. I still like it, but that one zone of my mouth is like really rebelling hard against this. So I'm going to give it a 6.5. That takes us to finish. I think the finish is pleasant. There's a nice Kentucky hug on the way down. It's definitely, like I said, alcohol forward for 90 proof. It reminds me of Blanton's in that way. It's definitely not as much of a chest burn as that other Buffalo Trace product, but it makes itself known. It leaves some of the fruit flavors in your mouth, not a lot of the oak, which I like. So I'm actually going to give it a 7 on the finish.
Yeah, there's not really a ton more to say here, Bob. This is just a really good above average whiskey. The finish has a nice bit of a Kentucky hug, nothing overpowering. I think it's here where you get a little bit more of that heavily wheated flavor. That it gets a little bit grainy on the finish, but overall it's a solid finish. I'll probably go with you, Bob, but we'll give it a 7 out of 10.
It's not bad. It's just, again, it's another one of those Buffalo Trace products where I'm like, what is the hype all about? And I understand if people are chasing the Pappy train and they're trying to get their hands on something cheaper. But the price on this has been driven up so far that I don't know if it's worth it. And when I think about like overall balance, I think it's actually a pretty well balanced whiskey, except for that one really prominently bad note on the taste. But again, like, I don't think this is as good as Weller Antique, and that's much more widely available than Weller 12. I'll give it a 7 on the balance, but that's about as much as I can do with it.
I actually think that this is a really well-balanced whiskey, Bob. The notes that you get on the nose run through the entire experience, and you have a lot of just really good, high-quality whiskey from start to finish. I think I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10 on balance.
Well, and that takes us to the price, Brad, and this is where things get weird. Because in the state of Ohio, a bottle of Weller 12 actually costs less than a bottle of Weller Antique. So they raised the price of Antique up to $50, but this one is at $40. It's $39.99. The problem is, this is so highly allocated that the state only gets a couple hundred bottles of it a year. And so they do a lottery to kind of, raffle off the opportunity to buy it. And because it's so allocated, they don't have to raise the price, which is what they do with Antique, which is not highly allocated. So, like, it's really weird, Brad, because Ohio is just weird in general with its price structure. If you go outside of a price-controlled state like Ohio, you will not find Weller 12 for less than $150. It's just not going to happen. I've seen people selling it at, like, insane markups on, one of our Instagram friends' overpriced bourbon. They post pictures of people, like, in Florida who are selling it for, like, $800 a bottle. It's insane how much they sell this whiskey for now. And I really do think, Brad, that if we're going to price this out for, 90% of America, we should probably set the price at about $150.
Unfortunately, at $150, I still think this is a good whiskey, but if you're going up into the triple digits range, it has to blow my socks off. You know what I mean? Like, this is not a whiskey that's going to, blow anybody out of the water. It's solid, but it's not worth $100, $150, or $200 or more dollars. So I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10 on value. I think that once again, you have a whiskey that is overhyped and overpriced. It's good, it's solid, but only for like a $40 to $50 price tag.
Brad, this doesn't stand up at all to something like a Pfeiffer Pavitt Reserve from Bardstown. In my opinion, this doesn't even come close to standing up to that Booker's we had a couple weeks ago, which is one of the best bourbons we've ever had on this podcast, and that's widely available, and it's like $89. You could almost buy 2 bottles of that for the price of one of these. Now, look, if you can get this at cost at $40 somehow, I actually would recommend it. I think it's a good whiskey. And especially at $40, it's like, you literally hit the lottery to get it. I would give it like a 9 out of 10 on that, just knowing what the allocation is like. But at $150, I absolutely cannot recommend that. And so I'm like, should I split the difference? Because I think I would give it like a 2 out of 10 on value at $150. So I guess I will kind of split the difference. And I'll give it a 5 out of 10 because I really don't know what people's situation is like trying to hunt this one down. Do not buy this at $150. If you can find it cheaper, it might be worth trying. If you can find it at a bar, I had a sample of it when I was at our friend's Justin's House of Bourbon in Lexington. There's one in Louisville as well. Most bourbon bars around the country will have a bottle of this. I think it's worth trying. Brad, as a product, like not including the price, would you recommend trying it?
Yeah, if you're able to get, a dram of this at the bar, go for it. It's really good, above average, solid whiskey. I mean, I would even say that if this was priced at $40, my score might come out to like a 38, 39 out of 50. But unfortunately, as it is, where we're at, I'm only coming out to a 33 out of 50 on this, and that's largely because I had that 3 out of 10 for value.
Yeah, and Brad, I'm coming out to a 34 on this, which brings our average to a 33.5 or a 67 out of 100. I think that's actually a pretty good place for this. I think that in terms of how it drinks and how much I enjoyed sipping on this, I would rate the whiskey itself definitely higher than a 33.5. But when we have to factor in value, this is a highly allocated product. It's probably one you're going to have to get at a bottle lottery, or you're going to have to get at a considerable markup. And so at the price that you're going to have to hunt it down for, I don't think that I can recommend buying it. I recommend the whiskey itself. I don't recommend going out and trying to find a bottle of it just because of how much you're going to have to spend.
Yeah, this is just another example of how I am just baffled by the whiskey industry. I don't get it. I don't understand how the product itself doesn't dictate the price. It feels like there's so many other factors that dictate how much this stuff costs.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that has been Weller 12 Year, a whiskey that we both enjoyed. One I would probably say we don't enjoy quite as much as Antique. Maybe one of our more controversial opinions on whiskey. We'll see what Film and Whiskey Nation thinks of it. But for now, Brad, let's get back into talking about Straight Outta Compton.
Let's get to it.
All right, so that was Weller 12, a whiskey that we are kind of divided on, actually, when I look at our scores, Brad. And we're getting back into talking about Straight Outta Compton, a movie that I don't know where you fall on yet. And so, Brad, let's talk about one of the most important performances in this movie from Academy Award nominee Paul Giamatti. I don't know, Brad, if he's good in this movie. I have gone back and forth on it because he's such a good actor. But he also can do like the Giamatti thing where he can overact a little bit. Like, he reminds me a lot of Stanley Tucci. I don't know if you know that actor, but like you'd recognize him if you saw him. He's in the Hunger Games. He can underplay things and really beautifully sell, his performance. He can also go way over the top. And this movie, Giamatti is going full Giamatti. He's got this ridiculous white hairpiece on that is so clearly fake throughout the film. And it's distractingly fake. And I feel like distractingly fake is kind of his whole performance, but it also kind of works. I don't know. What do you think of him?
Well, I think the issue is the fact that Giamatti is the perfect manager, and I'm saying that in air quotes, for any movie ever. Like we see him in that role in The Cinderella Man, and we see him in that role here in Straight Outta Compton. I just feel like he has, I don't know, it fits his personality. Like, Paul Giamatti is the perfect supporting actor I think that's ever been. And in a certain sense, the manager of a band is like the supporting actor of the band. Like, they make things possible. And I think it was really neat that they talked about that in the movie. Like, Giamatti's character says, like, you guys are great, but you need me to open the doors for you. Like, you're not going to make it if I'm not here for you. And I think that's what a good supporting actor does. They open the doors for the main character of the movie to charge on through and give a breakout performance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that whether it's the director or the editor who's reining Giamatti in as much as they can, maybe it's by cutting him out of stuff. I don't know. But they make sure that the young performers playing NWA are the ones who shine in this movie. Giamatti chews a lot of scenery. We haven't used that phrase in a while, but he does. And he still doesn't overtake scenes from these young actors. And I think that says a lot both about, how assured F. Gary Gray's direction is, and as well, how good the performances are from the five guys playing NWA.
Can we just go back for a second and repeat the fact that his fake hair is so bad.
Dude, we are like on a roll with bad wigs in these musical biopics. Like Giamatti in this movie and Freddie Mercury's parents from Bohemian Rhapsody need to just get together and just trade hair pieces back and forth.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a high school production bad. Like,
I don't get it. How are they not more convincing?
I don't know. This is freaking Hollywood that we're talking about here. And they can't get their costumes straight. Like, what are we doing?
Well, Brad, before we give our final scores, I do think it's worth noting, and we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, this movie does kind of sanitize NWA's lives in terms of some of the areas of their lives. You know, I think it does a really good job at capturing the drug culture, the gang culture, the police brutality of LA. However, especially when you look at a character like Dr. Dre, they play him as this really young, innocent kid who doesn't want to do anything except lay in his room and listen to records. And like, you know what? That might be true. But they really downplay a lot of aspects of his life, his real life. Like the fact that he did father a child who very briefly shows up in this movie and then is never seen again. And the fact that Dr. Dre, Ice Cube, and MC Ren were all notoriously involved in abuse scandals, where it was like pretty much definitively proven that they had been beating women throughout their NWA careers. And I read a really great article in the Washington Post from when this movie came out, and it really called the movie out on that. It said, look, it's a really well done movie. It's well acted. It's well directed. But here's my problem, Brad. Do I think that a biopic needs to include every aspect of somebody's life, positive or negative, and be as accurate as possible? No, I don't. Like we said earlier, this is a fictionalized version of a real person's life. But I think this is the problem you run into when the person that you're making the movie about is still alive. They get too much input into what can be included and what can't. And at the end of the day, NWA's music was distilled down solely to this. It was like, we make this art to talk about what we see in our day-to-day lives, which is true. They saw a lot of police brutality, but they also, in their music, are like incredibly misogynistic, violent towards women, and we know now from their real lives that they bore that out in their real lives. And so it's almost like they sweep under the rug certain aspects of their music, and they make it out to be that like their music was only ever about, you know, fighting the power and getting back at the police, when there's actually way more problematic elements there that just aren't discussed, that aren't gone into at all in this film.
And I think that's one of the issues. And it's something for me as somebody who I feel like I'm often able to see multiple sides to an issue. And in this movie, like, they are trying to help you see the issues that were faced by the members of NWA when they were growing up in their teenage and young adult years. And I can appreciate and empathize with those. But at the same time, like you said, Bob, it sanitizes the fact that there was a lot of really bad things happening. And the movie plays it off like these reporters are bad people for asking questions about their lyrics, about the glorification of drugs and how they treat women. And they just kind of brush them off like, nah, that's artistic liberty. I'm like, well, no, like those are real problems that face our country and that need to be addressed. And I don't know if NWA was great at addressing those issues.
Right. Well, I think one of the key flaws that they had in their approach, Brad, was that like they kind of played it off as we are playing characters. Like when we record an album, my name is no longer O'Shea Jackson. My name is Ice Cube. I am playing this character named Ice Cube. And like Ice Cube is a guy who has an AK-47 and is like using it on people. You know, when you step out of that, you can have a conversation about how like what they're doing with their art is trying to show America what life is like in Compton for a certain group of people. But the problem is that their real lives bled into that a little bit. And so it's always been hard for people, I think, to figure out like what part of their art is a critique of what they see around them and what part of it is glorifying things like violence against women. Like, I'm not bothered by the sort of violent lyrics or the revolutionary kind of lyrics that they have in their music. For me, that's no different than like the angry lyrics you get in punk rock. It's all about fighting authority. I totally get that. But what bothers me is that they try, and the screenwriters of this movie try to boil everything down to like, no, they were just trying to do this one very noble thing. But they don't actually get in the weeds and talk about like some of the more difficult and harder to explain away elements of the music.
And that kind of brings me to my final score. I like this movie, Bob. I think it's a really good biopic. I think it displays the lives of these young men really well. But there's some issues with it that I just can't quite get beyond. And I think I'm going to give it a 7.5 out of 10. It's a solid movie. It's far, far above average. But I don't know if it's deserving of like an 8 or higher.
Yeah, I'm right there with you, Brad. I've actually been kind of going back and forth between do I want to give it a 7.5 or a 7, because I feel like it's very well made. Like I applaud how well acted, how well directed this movie is. The cinematography I felt like was really gritty and realistic. But it is problematic, and it does have some of those pitfalls of a musical biopic that we've been talking about all month. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10. Because I think that the average score that we come out to, a 7.25, is probably the most accurate about how I feel with the movie. I think it is about a 7.25 out of 10.
But in the end, we need to know what you, Film and Whiskey Nation, have to say about this movie. Do you love Straight Outta Compton? Obviously, to a certain point you did, because y'all voted it onto our podcast. So let us know what you have to think. You could give us a shout out on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Film Whiskey.
Or you can give us a phone call. Leave a voicemail at our call-in line and we will play it on air. Our number is 216-800-5923. Once again, that number is 216-800-5923. Or you can go to anchor.fm/filmwhiskey and record a voicemail message for us there.
Next week, we're going to be getting a little bit spooky for Halloween. We are reviewing the Alfred Hitchcock classic, Psycho.
So join us for that. Until next week, I'm Bob Book.
I'm Brad G.
And we'll see you next time.